Energy Media is doing a deep dive into the Alberta energy regulator, and I was very pleased to find Dr. Lorne Fitch, who is a retired provincial fish and wildlife biologist and a former adjunct professor with the University of Calgary. Now, while he doesn't deal, his story about dealings with the AER is not on the oil and gas side, it's on the coal side. But the thing that interested me about his story is just how similar it is to those professionals, the interviews that I'm doing with folks on the oil and gas side. So welcome to the interview, Lorne.
Thank you, Mark. I'm pleased to be here.
Now, so your issue was around coal development on the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains. Tell us a little bit more about that and some of your concerns, please.
Well, the coal rush, which began 2019, 2020, was of concern to me based on my previous work in the eastern slopes as a fisheries biologist and as a fish and wildlife habitat biologist. And as I saw the applications roll in, and there were probably 8 to 10 coal companies vying for exploration rights from Rocky Mountain House south to the Crow's Nest Pass. And I noted that particularly for the Crow's Nest Pass region, particularly the Old Man River headwaters, there were adjoining coal exploration programs. And so I wanted to know from the AER how they were handling those applications, particularly in terms of what sort of environmental information were they asking the coal companies to undertake, and how that was referencing anything that they were telling the coal companies that they needed to do to protect particularly things like fish and wildlife and water quality.
Now, I saw the piece that you wrote about your experience, and it struck me as a non-biologist that the questions actually were fairly straightforward. I mean, you didn't ask any stumpers, as it were.
No, I simply wanted to know what the AER had asked the coal companies to undertake in terms of environmental impact assessment. Rather simple questions like, were they aware of fish and wildlife habitats? Were they aware of water quality parameters? What sort of reclamation standards were they going to use? And most importantly, because of the number of coal companies operating in a very limited area, was the AER going to ask the coal companies to do a cumulative effects analysis on a regional basis so that they would be better served to make better decisions about whether or not this was in the public interest?
Now, what did the AER tell you? Because I'm sorry, I shouldn't be smiling but it was almost comical the way they stonewalled you, wasn't it?
Yeah, essentially they told me what their mandate was, which I already knew. And in answer to my questions, they provided a bunch of bureaucratic gobbledygook that never answered the questions. And when I re-asked the questions again, I was told that that was all that I was going to get, and it was sort of a perfunctory PFO letter back to me.
Right. And you had a great way to explain this as a syllogism, which most first year philosophy students will understand. But for those of us who didn't take first year philosophy, maybe explain your syllogism.
Well, a syllogism is simply, an example would be a cat has 4 legs. My dog has 4 legs, therefore my dog has to be a cat. And so the AER's response was, well, we have regulations and legislation that protects the environment. Therefore, the environment must be protected.
Right.
And that's that. My dog doesn't get that, and neither did I.
Right. And so basically what they're saying is the legislation is set out to protect the environment. We are tasked with protecting the environment under that legislation, under those regulations. Therefore, we're doing our job.
Essentially that, yes. Yeah. Despite the inability to answer any of my fundamental questions about how you undertake an environmental impact assessment for a scale of activities that was as large as what I was looking at.
Now, what were the conclusions that you drew from your interactions with the AER?
Well, again, a disappointment that they were not forthright in answering the questions, as well as, and this is part of my further investigation of finding out, whether they had contacted any provincial fish and wildlife biologists to get information on fish and wildlife habitat populations, sensitive areas, sensitive times that would help guide their information and response back to the companies. I found out they had not contacted anybody that was a content expert in doing that. Um, I was stunned by the fact that the turnaround time for applications is as little as 5 days. So very little time to collect information. Essentially what they did was ask the coal companies to do a desktop analysis, which is, just scratching the surface and providing approvals, literally within hours sometimes of a request.
Yeah, this is really interesting because I see this on the oil and gas side all the time, where the AER is trying to cut red tape and it tries to automate as much of the process as it can. And this desktop analysis seems to fit right into that trend. What exactly is a desktop analysis?
It's reviewing what is currently available and easily available on Government of Alberta websites, for example, on fisheries and wildlife populations. But the problem is that those are largely incomplete. There are gaps in that information because the province has not done a particularly good job on, keeping inventories up to date. And what it leads to, or what it should lead to, is asking a number of questions that a formal environmental impact assessment should ask and answer before the regulator makes a decision on the application.
Now, Lorne, over and over again in my interviews with experts on the oil and gas side, they keep coming back to this point that there are two broad interests at stake for the regulator. One is the public interest, which they're tasked to protect in the legislation and the regulations. It's very clear. And the other, of course, is the industry interest, because Alberta is an exporter of energy, and so it's in its best interest to do a good job of attracting capital, creating jobs, and all of that. The problem here is, from the oil and gas folks are telling me, is that the interest should be balanced, but it has now become very unbalanced. And the AER is now too cozy with the industry and looks and prioritizes the industry interest over the public interest. Now, would those observations apply here?
Very much so, Markham. I think that there's a sense, perhaps amongst the public who aren't aware of some of these things, that the AER is the provincial watchdog. Well, my sense is that they are a lapdog for industry and are actually an enabler for industry and do not function in the public interest, particularly related to biodiversity issues.
And another observation from the oil and gas side, and I wonder if it applies to your side, is the idea that this has become more and more pronounced over the years. It wasn't the case maybe as much 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 10 years ago, even as it is today. Any observations from your interactions with the AER one way or the other on that?
Yeah, and I would go back. I was a former fish and wildlife habitat biologist. And so, we reviewed things like coal exploration programs and oil and gas exploration, well sites, and so forth, and provided information and recommendations to provincial regulators. And as a consequence of that, although there was never a sense that we could say no, we said yes in a variety of ways that created much better insight into the consequences of some of those activities, how to compensate or mitigate for them, maybe to move them, and in some cases that they were just not appropriate, that there was no compensation or mitigation available. And I think that overriding function has been lost with the transfer of all of those tasks, if you will, to the AER. They simply do not have the capacity, the capability, or maybe even the will to undertake reliable, in-depth assessments of these activities and to provide information to industry and as well to help the public understand how the public interest is being protected.
Well, based on your decades of experience, would you give us your opinion on this question? Is the AER adequately protecting the public interest in particularly in the coal development, which you're more familiar with?
Only if the public is Australian coal companies. That's the only public whose interests seem to be served with the response that we see from the AER.
Well, Lorne, thank you very much for your insights on this. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Markham, and thank you for taking on this task. I think the time to review the AER is well overdue.